And to us, Congresswoman, welcome back to the show. We're glad to have you. So this nearly 1,000-page text of the bill, it was released just before midnight on Friday. And among some of the last-minute changes, a concession to GOP moderates that delays cuts to provider taxes that fund state Medicaid obligations. I'm curious your thoughts on the Senate's version of this legislation. Is it going to get any Democratic votes?
I don't think it will get any Democratic votes because the fact of the matter is, while they made some changes to the provider taxes and it created a slush fund for rural hospitals because they know that this is really going to impact rural hospitals, it's still a bill that fundamentally guts Medicaid and SNAP and is going to make millions of people in our country less healthy and hungry. And that is not something that I think any Democrat will go for.
Give me a sense of what your constituents are saying about how they would be affected if this bill passes, and the number one concern that you're hearing from them.
Yeah, look, in San Diego, where I represent, 1 in 5 people rely on Medicaid for their health care.
Wow.
In fact, nationwide, 40% of all births rely on Medicaid for their coverage. Now, the Republicans claim to be a party that want us to have more babies. Well, 40% of all births rely on Medicaid, and yet they're gutting it. And so I've been talking to my constituents, and, you know, I met Delilah, who's 5 years old. She has a number of different health conditions, and the only way that she can get the health care she needs is through Medicaid. Or 2-year-old Caesar, who has 20 to 30 medical appointments a month because of his medical conditions. And again, Medicaid is the only reason that his family is able to afford it. These are the real people who are going to be impacted by these cuts that Republicans are making.
Oof, boy, let that sink in, won't you? Let's go to Iran now, because the Trump administration limited the classified information that it shared with Congress. Did you leave that briefing convinced the strikes were as successful as the White House claims? And was the case made that the Iran threat was dire enough to justify military force without congressional approval? I'm curious if there are questions that still remain unanswered for you.
There are a lot of questions. I did not hear anything in that briefing that convinced me that Iran's nuclear program is destroyed. And I also did not hear anything that convinced me that this was any sort of imminent threat that would have required the president to make this unilateral decision without Congress. So I still have a lot of questions in terms of what the battle damage is, you know, what they thought they were doing, what the strategy is. But fundamentally, this was a reckless decision that is going to make it harder to get any sort of diplomatic agreement. And if, you know, there's nothing now that would stop the Iranians from secretly creating a nuclear weapon and you know, then feeling like they're more protected because of the strike. Whereas before, we were able to see more about what was going on, and especially under the Iran deal, under the JCPOA, when we really were able to see what was happening and be able to monitor the situation.
This ceasefire between Iran and Israel, I mean, it appears to be holding. Iran's supreme leader warned against any further attacks. President Trump said the U.S. and Iran will hold nuclear talks next week, though Tehran has not confirmed that any talks are taking place. Are you surprised the truce has held so far? And do you think Iran will be open to negotiating a nuclear deal after these attacks?
I'm glad that the ceasefire is stable for now. You know, I have family who lives in Israel, and so, you know, they were sending me pictures from their bomb shelter during all of this, which is part of why I'm so against all of this, because it is the civilians in Iran and Israel who are paying the price for these reckless decisions by both Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Trump. And look, I hope that the diplomatic negotiations are successful and that they're able to get to a deal. However, I think these strikes actually made it less likely that they're going to, because between Donald Trump pulling out of the initial JCPOA Iran deal and then Donald Trump using the ruse of negotiations to trick them and then doing the strike instead, I don't see why the Iranians have any reason to trust or believe that any agreement they come to with us would actually be upheld.
Minority leaders Chuck Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries, they have been pretty muted in their response to the strikes. Like most rank-and-file members, they have rebuked President Trump for bypassing Congress, but they haven't condemned the use of force. Is this bombing of Iran a bigger overstep of executive authority than past presidents, like incidents in Libya, Syria, Nicaragua come to mind? Should Democrats have delivered a stronger, unified response to these strikes?
I think so. This is definitely a bridge further than any other president would go. Look, I spoke out. I did not think that the Biden administration strikes in Syria were necessarily, under their Article 2 authority. But, one of the things we have to remember is that the authorization for the use of military force from 2001 and 2003 that authorized the Afghanistan and Iraq wars are still in place. And so while I didn't agree with many of the strikes, many of the legal scholars said that those authorizations were what allowed the strikes that Obama did, for instance, in Iraq and Syria against ISIS, what President Biden did in Syria against ISIS. And so, this is something where there's no reading of those authorizations that could at all say that it is consistent with what President Trump did. And I think it's clear it's the same neocons and war hawks that have been jonesing for war with Iran for years that are now getting us into this war. And this time they're not even bothering to come to Congress.
Let me ask you quickly about the administration's immigration crackdown, and specifically that Orange County, California landscaper living just to the north of your district who was caught on video being brutalized by federal agents before being arrested. The undocumented man is the father of 3 U.S. Marines, one of them telling MSNBC, if he had treated a detainee the same way while serving as a Marine, it would have been a war crime. Is this what Americans who support the president's immigration agenda want to see?
Look, I don't think so. I represent San Diego. It's a border community, and we understand the important role that immigrants play in our society, in our community, in our economy. I think this story really goes to show how broken our immigration system is, that this man could be here trying to get documentation, have 3 sons who are serving the United States military and is still unable to get legal status. He had no criminal record, as far as I can tell. And even if he is a criminal, this is not appropriate use of force, especially once someone is handcuffed. And so I'm very concerned. I'm concerned about the policy of having ICE agents cover their face. We've had in San Diego a number of instances of agents in plain clothes not fully identifying themselves and taking people. This is all intended to terrify the community. And it's really bad for our public safety because people can impersonate these agents now. There's no check against that. And it means that we're going to have less folks going and reporting real crimes that we need our local law enforcement to be addressing.